from Dr. Brendan Gabriel from the University of Aberdeen. Brendan did his PhD there and has found his way back via working in Copenhagen, Karolinska Institute in Sweden, Edinburgh University, and he's now at the Rowett Institute, a very renowned institute now linked with Aberdeen University. So I am going to let him explain what he does, because I'm not sure that I can, and hopefully I can come out of this one and let Brendan.
I'm happy to sit down.
You've got yours?
Yes, I'm sure I can take up.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So firstly, a massive thanks to Claire and Tom for the invitation to speak here today. Really excited to talk to you today about circadian rhythms and diabetes, what might go wrong in metabolic disease in terms of circadian rhythms, and what we can potentially do to, as we term it, sort of reset the clock. And just a massive thank you to everyone in the audience for turning out on what might be a slightly wet and windy evening in Perth. So before I get into my talk today, I didn't realise Claire was going to do such a fantastic introduction, so I've actually got a few slides just to quickly introduce myself. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Aberdeen, as Claire said. That means I lead a small team of researchers, and part of my job is to sort of give lectures and talks either to students or fellow scientists, and I apologise in advance. I've had quite a busy week of lectures, so I may well lose my voice slightly in the talk tonight, but hopefully I won't sound too much like a jazz singer. So we work in a variety of lab settings. We have a molecular biology lab where we sort of take samples and look at the sort of, as I said, the molecular biology, and we also work with some human trials as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And sometimes we take a break from science and manage to go for walks in the hills as well. And as Claire said, I'm originally from Wales, from a town called Newport, if anybody knows that. I moved to Aberdeen when I was very young, when I was about 18, and to study, and I've been there on and off ever since. And my better half and my daughter are Scottish, so I'm an adopted Scot. And I spent time, as Claire said, in the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, where a lot of the work I'm going to talk about tonight was initiated, and then I've transferred some of that to Aberdeen. I briefly worked at University of Copenhagen and Edinburgh as well. So what is circadian rhythm? What am I actually talking about tonight? So many of you are probably familiar, well, I assume everyone is familiar with the sleep-wake cycle. So everyone knows that we go to sleep at night and we wake up during the day. But what's the sort of biology that underpins that? So we can look at a little bit at the sort of physiological components of the sleep-wake cycle and some of the hormones that actually drive the sleep-wake cycle. So two of these really important hormones are cortisol and melatonin, and they are sort of inverse in their regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. So these are really, really important hormones that cycle in an oscillatory manner, and I'm going to talk a lot today about oscillations over a 24-hour cycle. So if you get familiar with this sort of graph, and you can look at these oscillations and view them sort of as waves, rising and falling, having peaks and troughs over a 24-hour cycle, this will inform a lot of the more molecular biology that I'm going to cover tonight. But if you always have this picture in mind of this, we're essentially flattening out a clock into a set of waves. And that's how we often think about circadian rhythms. So, because the Earth has a day-night cycle, nearly all of biology on Earth has evolved to have a circadian rhythm. So we think that circadian rhythms evolved in biology billions of years ago. They appear to be, from what we know about evolutionary biology, they appear to be have evolved very early on in the development of even single-celled organisms. And we think that's because the day-night cycle of the Earth is incredibly important to how organisms deal with the environment they're in. One of the driving factors, we believe, is UV light. So UV light, of course, is what gives rise to life on Earth, gives energy to the planet. But as we all know, in too high doses, it can be harmful, and that's the same for single-celled organisms as well. So exposure to too much UV light can be harmful for even a single-celled organism. So we know that single-celled organisms have actually evolved firstly protective mechanisms and also repair mechanisms that can deal with the effects of UV light. So we think this is one of the earliest examples of the evolution of circadian rhythms. As life has become more complex, we've evolved into multicellular organisms and complex life has evolved. Circadian rhythms evolved along with it and became more complex as well. But we also know that when these rhythms go wrong, they are biologically important and they control lots of important biology within the body. But when these rhythms go wrong, they can either be involved with or they can actually cause diseases. And I'm particularly interested in metabolic disease. So going back to one of the simplest of circadian rhythms, sleep. So most of you probably are aware that when we don't get enough sleep, we feel terrible in the short term. And if that happens repeatedly over a long time, that can lead to, that's associated at least with metabolic disease. So to give you an example of this, I was involved in a study. I didn't lead this, but I was involved in a study with other academic colleagues. So we took a large sample of people that had been recorded over a long period of time in the United States, and within the sample there were about 5,000 participants. And what we did, it was quite simple. So in this study, the participants had their sleep recorded. So it wasn't what we call the gold standard of recording of sleep. The researchers in this study just asked the participants how well they slept, and they did that in quite a fairly expansive questionnaire. And what we observed in that study is that people who got worse sleep had more adiposity, so they had more fat in their bodies, and people who got more sleep tended to be leaner and more metabolically healthy. And this has been shown over several studies, time and time again, we see similar findings to this. So we know that sleep is incredibly important. But as I said, there are lots of other biological and physiological circadian rhythms. And again, many of these you are probably familiar with, so things like coordination, It definitely is a factor. There's not that much research in terms of the sort of metabolic rhythms that's been done, so I think it's certainly important. We know, in the north, in the northern hemisphere, we have, or the northern latitudes, so obviously I worked in Sweden and the north of Scotland. There were huge seasonal changes in daylight exposure, and we have to account for that in our studies. So in the winter, we actually, this is a known phenomenon as well, that people with diabetes have much worse glucose control on average in the winter than they do in the summer, and we think that part of the reason for that is the lack of daylight exposure. So my advice would be in the winter, it's really important to get out in the middle of the day, get some daylight exposure, and that helps reset your SCN and your metabolic circadian rhythms as well.
Can I just ask, as a on from that, is diabetes more common in northern latitudes than, say, equatorial regions? Or
yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, it is more prevalent, but there's so many confounding factors that it's hard to say whether that's due to circadian rhythm. So it tends to be, historically it's been more prevalent in the industrialized countries because of many factors, a lack of physical activity and a change in we have much more highly processed foods in the industrialized countries. Diabetes is now becoming much more prevalent in developing countries as well. In fact, some of those are now overtaking, the prevalence in developing countries is overtaking diabetes prevalence in the UK and the US and Europe. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer.
David.
When I was young, I noticed I had a tendency to follow a lunar rhythm, rising an hour later every day if left to myself. And I remember reading that some people, quite a lot of people, have a biological clock that runs slow. Does that happen at all at the cellular level?
Yes, it does, yeah. So one of the things we observed is that the clocks in people from diabetes had a low expression, they were less robust, and often they tended to be a little bit longer than 24 hours. So that's hence why they were becoming disrupted. And that's also observed with aging as well. So it's been shown a few times now that either taking cells out of the body from people who are older compared to people who are younger, the rhythms will be 25 hours, maybe 26 hours, a bit longer than 24 hours, hence why they become disrupted. So that is often associated with disease and aging, but clearly there are also mutations in the clock genes that are prevalent in the population as well that might affect those rhythms as well.
Yes.
When you said there that you were looking at older people, is there physical sort of like their activity levels, does that dictate the length of their circadian rhythms at all? So like healthier, fitter people would have shorter circadian rhythms? Absolutely, yeah. So again, studies have been done. So a group of researchers in the Netherlands have done a lot of these studies where they've taken people who are very fit, they've taken people who are sort of normal, and they've taken people who are overweight or have diabetes, and they see similar findings to us, that the people who are very fit have really strong, robust circadian rhythms, and it decreases with the disease state. So yeah, I think it increases the robustness of circadian rhythms, and with aging, I think there's many biological kind of processes that intrinsically disrupt it as well.
I actually have a question. So, through no fault of my own, at one point in my career, I found myself in a job where I had to commute to Asia regularly, all the time. And so I had jet lag, like, all the time. And this went on for several years. Is that likely to have messed up my health? That's a serious question, actually. Yeah. The effects of jet lag on circadian rhythms on your health.
Yeah, I mean, jet lag absolutely disrupts your circadian rhythm. And again, you know, lots of studies have tried to sort of show the disruption effect in a lab. You know, the problem we have that there's lots of other confounding factors when we fly on a long distance flight, we're commuting for work, etc. There's lots of factors that can affect our short-term kind of health. So things like glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity, etc. You know, they're all shown to be negatively affected by long travel distances. But I think you're right that disruption of circadian rhythm clearly does occur from long distance flights, and I think that's part of the factors that actually can cause slightly, at least on the short term, negative health outcomes from long term travel. But the good news is that, you know, you can mitigate that if you sort of do lots of healthy things in the short term as well. Yeah.
Wall. Yeah. How do I get there? John. Could you pass the...
Talk about exercise, Tom.
Oh yeah, exercise.
So my question is, has your research into this field inspired you to modify your own personal habits so that to the point where you feel broadly and generally that you're experiencing benefits that would be difficult to measure with the sort of precision of the experiments you've been doing?
That's a good question.
That is a very good question. I think, you know, along with many academics, I would say very much practice what I preach, not what I do. You know, but I do try to exercise when I've stepped off a plane, or you know, I've sort of had a night shift in the lab, for instance. I clearly find exercise very beneficial on a short-term basis and a long-term basis as well. And we're, you know, in the lab, we're always playing around with lots of the wearable technology, measuring our own blood sugar. So we have a pretty good idea of what changes our blood sugar. And I know that after a few social activities on a Friday night, on a Saturday morning, my blood sugar is much less well regulated. So yeah, but exercise can mitigate that on the short term. So.
I'm going to pursue you once again on the jet lag question, because I'm sure there's quite a few people here travel. So jet lag is a disruption of the circadian rhythm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the best strategy then for dealing with jet lag?
Well, yeah, I'm cautious to answer that because I don't think there's strong enough evidence to say that there is a perfect strategy. But we know, you know, what I've shown is exercise is a pretty potent regulator of the muscle clock. We also know that it affects lots of other circadian rhythms in the body, and clearly daylight, as I was saying earlier, is really important as well. So I think getting fresh air, daylight, exercise, along, you know, to wake yourself up is good, and then not having those things near your bedtime is good as well. And obviously adjusting your body as much as you can to the local time zone if you're going to be there for more than a week or so.
Questions? Yes. Oh, you were going to do the vote of thanks, weren't you?
I wasn't.
No.
You talked about daylight, but because we live in a northern country, the recommendation seems to be take vitamin D and vitamin B12 and vitamin C.
Is it? Yeah.
Would that, are they any help, or do we need daylight? Pure and simple.
Yeah, so it's, you know, I'm not, that's not my area of expertise at all. I know, sorry, apologies, but I attended a really interesting debate recently at the Society for Endocrinology, and they had a very interesting debate with both sides of the pro-vitamin D supplementation and the anti-vitamin D supplementation well represented. So I think the evidence from the scientific community is not clear-cut yet in terms of, one of the issues is, again, this is a correlation versus causation effect. So low levels of vitamin D are associated with poor health. Okay, sounds really bad. However, fat takes up vitamin D, so we store vitamin D in fat. So if people have higher adiposity, higher BMI, they tend to have lower BMI. They tend to have lower vitamin D. Is that because they have lower vitamin D, or is that because they have higher adiposity? It's not really clear. But we also know that getting daylight exposure, particularly in the summer, is much, much more effective at synthesizing vitamin D and metabolizing it than taking it as a supplement. But there might still be some health benefits to supplementing vitamin D even in the winter. So I can't really give you a clear-cut answer on that. And the latest that I've heard from the scientific community is divided on that as well.
Yes. Yes, young lady. Speak loud and clear.
Is diabetes more is diabetes more likely in younger people than like older people?
Great question. So,
Thank you.
so type 1 diabetes often develops in younger people before they kind of reach maturity. So type 1 diabetes might be evident in young people. Type 2 diabetes generally is more associated with aging, so people who tend to develop it when they're a bit older. So.
Perhaps I could just add to that point if I
Ah,
may.
yes. Do you want to use the microphone? Here we go.
It partly relates to a comment
You
that
have to
you
hold
made.
it so that it faces your mouth.
Sorry.
That's it.
It partly relates to a comment that you made about people in the third world countries now
Yeah.
getting more type 2.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a paediatrician looking after children with type 1,
Mm-hmm.
but towards the end of my time, in the 90s and early this century, we were seeing more teenagers with type 2. And that was nearly always associated with increased weight.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually commoner in our Asian children than in our Caucasian children.
Yeah.
So it is increasing in young children, type 2 as well as type 1.
I totally agree.
Okay.
Actually,
Thank you.
Jason Gill and Naveed Sattar from the University of Glasgow have done really important work looking at ethnic differences and the outcomes of metabolic disease. So people of South Asian descent and ethnicity develop metabolic disease on average at a much lower BMI, as you suggested, than people from Europe and the US. So there appears to be ethnic differences in the association between adiposity, BMI, and metabolic disease.
Oh, David again.
Just to follow
you-
on from what you've said there,
Yeah.
does that change if somebody of South Asian origin is still living in South Asia?
Yeah.
Is that a different outcome than somebody of South Asian origin who's now living in the north?
Great question. I think the answer is we probably don't have enough long-term data to really answer that question, but it seems to be multi-generational at least. So one of the issues when we look at inherited factors versus environmental factors is genetics are important, but we also have inherited factors that are not genetic, epigenetic as well. And they can change in response to environment, but they can also be passed on, they can also be inherited as well. So it becomes a really confusing picture whether things are intrinsic in the body or whether they're environmental. But again, I saw Jason Gill present recently, and if I remember correctly, his recent or his latest data kind of shows that there is at least 3 generational kind of effect in people whose grandparents have come from South Asia. They still have this change in metabolism compared to people who are sort of have ethnicity from the UK.
Yeah. David again.
Can I come back to my lunar question? From a different angle. From an archaeological angle, a
Yes.
number of people have thought that the lunar cycle was more important to to early humans than it is now. And there are various reasons for thinking that. And I wonder if there are any ways of investigating that biologically, thinking about differences in the way that circadian rhythms operate. Because things like prehistoric monuments and the actual living patterns of people who still live somewhat as people did live, say 20,000 years ago, might suggest that the lunar cycle was very important to that period.
It might well be, yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'm gonna answer this question by slightly reframing it and then talking about something I want to talk about. As I said, daylight is super important to circadian rhythms. I don't know so much about lunar cycles. That would be a different type of rhythm rather than a circadian rhythm. It's not a 24-hour cycle, clearly. But we know that our circadian rhythms are sort of disrupted by artificial light, our work environments, being indoors all day. That disrupts our circadian rhythms, and we think a lot of the chronotype differences that people have are more exacerbated in these artificial environments than they are in a more natural environment. So they've actually done studies, again in the US, where they took people with very different chronotypes, so very, very extreme morning owls and very, very extreme morning larks and very extreme night owls. They took them on a camping expedition, so they were hiking all day, exposed to daylight, I guess somewhat more similar to what our early ancestors might have had. And what they saw is those chronotypes became much more similar. So the exposure to daylight, physical activity, fresh air, made people's rhythms much more similar. So I think that does speak somewhat to your question in my own reframing of that. Yeah?
Do you know if the rhythms of both people sort of...
Could I use that so people can hear? Yeah.
Do you know if the rhythms from this tended to like a general middle, or was it more like the night owls were becoming morning people and the morning people were becoming more night owls?
If I remember the data correctly, it was track. Yeah, I don't recall if it was middle or morning, but it said it was. They were rising at dawn, effectively. So, yeah.
Oh yes. Okay. I am getting my exercise tonight, haven't I?
Sorry.
If you point it directly towards your mouth when you words. Yeah.
So, for type 2, this has been type 2 diabetes, but there's also, you've also got like more of the monogenic diabetes, and I was wondering if there's any link between any monogenic types of diabetes and clock genes, or?
Yeah, fantastic question. So, there are some early studies that have shown that people with polymorphisms in the core clock, so normally single letter changes in their genetic code in these core clock genes, particularly with the period gene, actually, the PER3 gene, seems to have an association with poorer insulin sensitivity. It's very, very early stage data. So we know mutations in these core clock genes are associated with sleep disorders. That's very clearly shown. There's some early evidence that it might be associated with metabolic disease as well.
How are we doing? Any more questions? Or is that...
If somebody...
Oh, wait a minute. You have a question? I knew Gordon would have a question.
If somebody
I was waiting for that.
Like night shift,
It's okay.
Yeah.
shift work for long enough.
Yeah.
Do they get habituated? Can they change
There
their
was some
biological clock?
questions about seasonal changes.
Sorry, Ash.
Sorry.
There's some reference to seasonal changes.
Yeah.
What's the situation in the Antarctic and the Arctic among peoples who got to survive 7 months of complete darkness?
Yeah.
What does that do to the circadian rhythms?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there have been some studies done in that. It's kind of early days, we just don't have enough data to really say for sure. But on the physiological level, clearly, 24 hours of darkness or very, very long nights does change the physiological rhythms. We don't know so much about the molecular clock, but I would presume that it's also changed, but we don't know for sure.
Oh, yes, here we go. It's the best strategy for this one. Here we go. Thank you.
It's a short question. I was going to ask you what's your next research topic, or what's the thing you really want to focus on next?
So we're really interested in the kind of metformin interaction. So we want to, we had that small study during COVID. We want to expand that now and see if we can do a much bigger study and sort of apply chronomedicine, apply some of these precise timings of medication, exercise, nutrition to people with diabetes, and actually see if that makes a difference in their day-to-day lives. That's what we're trying to do, and as a typical research academic, I'm always applying for funding, so I have to sell the data and project. And also, I really want to do more research on shift workers. So as I said, we have a huge population of shift working healthcare workers on the Forest Hill site. So I think looking at that, we're actually working with NHS colleagues at the moment to sort of show the science that underpins their shift work roster policy, but it would be great to actually, alongside that, collect more data on shift workers and give more information, inform their decisions on that as well.
What about submariners who are under sea for long months of time?
It's a good question, because what about submariners? What about astronauts? What about Elon Musk sending people to Mars? I mean, there's a whole lot of... I can totally see that, a lot of occupations mess with your body rhythms.
It's fantastic question. Logistically, a little bit more challenging to monitor, but feasible. It's easier for us to monitor people who are right next to us. But we shouldn't always do science because it's easy. So I think it's a great question. And on the astronaut point, just quickly, some of my colleagues have actually done work on that, particularly on the muscle. So a few factors there: the circadian rhythms, but also the weightlessness critically changes muscle. And there's some evidence that radiation exposure as well can change the reactive oxygen species and the way the mitochondria operate. So some really interesting data as well.
Okay, well, if there's, so maybe one last question. Yep. Okay. Here you go. If to use the.
Sorry, it's a little bit ridiculous. Well, you said the science shouldn't always be easy. Would you be willing to go into